Ever since the first programs flickered onto our screens, filmmakers, presenters and experts have all turned to television to bring art out of museums and galleries and into our living rooms.
Now, all this may seem rather vulgar. Quite right, it is.
As the great masters became available to millions instead of hundreds, program makers found new ways for us to appreciate them, from the faintly ridiculous to the downright astonishing.
That's extraordinary.
One artist above all others used the big and the small screen to promote his art, as well as himself. So what can the archives tell us about the inimitable world of Salvador Dali? He shocked the world through film, fashion, sculpture and architecture, but is best known for his striking dreamlike images.
Hollowable painting.
His name became synonymous with the art movement called Surrealism.
A visual equivalent of rock music.
I've looked through dozens of BBC programmes to try and understand the real Salvador Dali, not just the eccentric show-off that we usually see.
Je suis fou du chocolat Lanvin.
So let's see what almost a century of archive reveals about one of modern art's greatest showmen. As an art historian, one of the things that fascinates me is how television has impacted on the art world. It's brought art to a much wider audience, of course, but it also helped to create a relatively new phenomenon, the celebrity artist. And one in particular blazed a trail for all who would follow. I can think of few other artists who pursued fame and fortune as aggressively as Salvador Dali. He actively turned himself into a brand, shamelessly promoting himself by any means necessary. And as with any brand, to be truly successful, you need a logo that's instantly recognizable. His trademark tash has been celebrated or mocked in just about every program about him, from Blue Peter to Alistair Sook's Modern Masters, and of course, The Late Show.
Much has been written about this genius of the melting watch and careering moustaches.
His moustache was the only rival to Van Gogh's ear and Picasso's potency.
If you mention Dali's name today, most people think of, well, they think of a big moustache.
My moustache is like a pair of antennas. They receive cosmic vibrations.
In 1955, veteran writer and broadcasting legend Malcolm Muggeridge seemed much more interested in Dali's facial furniture than anything to do with his work.
The first question that I wanted to put you, it really ought to be about modern art, but I can't help it. How did you manage to produce those marvellous moustaches?
In the beginning of this moustache, used one very natural product, dates, you know, the fruit.
I know.
Well, Dali's moustache has become his brand, like, you know, Van Gogh's ear or Andy Warhol's slippy wig.
And it was a sort of natural response, in a way, from Muggeridge to ask him about that, although perhaps I wish he'd asked him a bit more about his work.
You feel you can face the world with that wonderful moustache standing up?
Just because every day becoming much more practical for my inspiration.
When this interview was filmed in the mid-1950s, Dali was roughly at the halfway point of his career. He'd spent the previous 30 years building his reputation as one of the leading lights of the artistic movement with which he's most closely associated, Surrealism. But he wasn't actually the founder of that movement. That honour belongs to André Breton, a French writer and poet who, in the aftermath of World War I, became the leader of a small band of surrealist artists and writers. Influenced by the work of psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud, their goal was to explore the world of dreams and the unconscious mind. In 2007, Alan Yentob's Imagine series took us to Paris, Surrealism's headquarters. Taking his cue from Breton's fondness for giving lectures, he filled us in on the origins of this movement.
Breton discovered Freud's theories during the First World War as a trainee doctor treating victims of shell shock. After the war, he took Freud's theories and applied them to art. Breton was Surrealism's godfather. Breton was Surrealism's midwife. Breton was Surrealism's seamstress. He stitched together the scraps of art and culture, politics and poetry, science and exotica that could be found in the Paris of the early 1920s, and he created a patchwork that he called Surrealism. The mentally ill suggested what art, uncensored by the rational mind, could look like. Spiritualists revealed the secrets of automatic writing. And tribal art, plundered from all over the world, added a dash of what they would have called the primitive. André Breton pulled all of these diverse ideas together, and in 1924 he published a manifesto, the first of many, and Surrealism was born.
I think for Alan Yentob just to kind of reel off a rather facile shopping list is not really getting it at all, because those are things that the Surrealists were interested in as means by which the subconscious had been revealed. But actually the movement in and of itself was about making you see the world in a different way.
Surrealism is attempting to reform society. It has an extremely high aim, and it does so in very complicated ways, mainly initially through literature, but then eventually into other art forms, including painting and film.
At this stage, however, Dali wasn't even a member of this group. He was studying painting at Madrid's Royal Academy of Fine Arts. Taking a slightly different approach, biographer Ian Gibson went in search of the artist's developing persona, tracking down the last surviving of Dali's Academy friends, José Velo.
Te ruego que me expliques un poco, porque Dalí, claro, es conocido mundialmente como el gran exhibicionista y Dalí y tal y cual, pero tú has dicho...
Eso es la reacción a su timidez. Esa audacia de la que ha presumido y ha pasado a la posteridad, esa audacia de Dalí, ese desgarro de Dalí, eso es la lucha contra su propia timidez. Y Dalí era un tímido absolutamente, un tímido de arriba abajo.
Tú has dicho que...
Dalí era un tímido casi patológico.
If Gibson's film is correct, Dali's outrageous behaviour began as a cover for his chronic shyness. But it soon got him into trouble with the Academy, as long-running BBC art series Arena allowed Dali himself to explain.
Me expulsaron 2 veces, por el mismo precio 2 veces. Pero la vez que me gusta más es una vez que había un tribunal incompetente totalmente por lo que nos había enseñado, el cual hizo aquello de tirar unas bolitas para saber qué teníamos que contestar. Yo abro mi papel y me encuentro con Rafael, tenía que hablar con Rafael. Entonces me levanté y dije, señores, con todo el respeto, me es imposible hablar de ese sujeto delante de los 3 profesores porque yo sé mucho más sobre Rafael que todos ustedes reunidos. Entonces, naturalmente, consejo de disciplina y expulsión por 1 año de la escuela.
Dali's expulsion deeply angered his father, a strict disciplinarian, filmed here by another of Dali's Academy friends, the film director Luis Buñuel. Dali's mother had died of breast cancer when he was 16, and his father, a successful lawyer in the small Catalonian town of Figueres, took it for granted that his only son would follow in his footsteps. This growing rift meant that instead of returning to his family home in Figueres, Dali set up shop in the nearby seaside resort of Cadaqués. Rather than turn to archive, Alistair Sooke took a typically immersive approach, visiting the landscape that shaped Dali's art.
The Dali family used to spend their holidays here, and it's where I'm meeting Dali's biographer, Ian Gibson.
And he fell utterly, totally and madly in love with the place, and I can understand why, because it's quite magical.
How important is it to understand this place in terms of his later art?
It's absolutely vital. I mean, all the early drawings, the early paintings, the church figures, and I don't know how many of. And I would say everything here, the people, the houses, the architecture, the boats. And without Cadaqués, there is no Dali. It's as straightforward as that. I think really he identifies totally with this landscape.
Dali's childhood paintings of Cadaqués show his incredible natural talent. He made this one when he was just 15.
You know, he could draw from the day he was born. He just had it in the blood. I suppose that's why he thought very early on he was a genius.
And did everyone else?
He could do it. And everybody said, he can do it. When he paints a duck, it's a duck. When it's a swan, his mother said, as he scratched off the paint on a table in Figueras. He just was born with this gift.
In the early days, he painted fairly conventional things, portraits, landscapes, cityscapes, and particularly, obviously, the environment around him in Catalonia, where he grew up. But I think what happens is he starts to receive ideas about avant-garde developments in Europe from these magazines that he has access to. And gradually he builds and builds up his knowledge of modern art and eventually develops his own language.
By the second half of the 1920s, Dali was selling enough of his work to fund a life independent of his father, as well as frequent trips to the cultural hotspots of Barcelona, Madrid and Paris. As Arena explained, this led to his first glimpse of surrealism.
Despite his father's disapproval, Dali continued to paint. In the seaside town of Cadaqués, he began to produce canvases which show a new interest, surrealism. In the magazine La Révolution Surréaliste, Dali had seen reproductions of the work of artists like the Catalan Juan Miró. Their work impressed him, and under this new influence he began to discover a style of his own.
Surprisingly, though, Dali's ticket into Breton's inner circle of surrealists wasn't due to paintings like these. It was thanks to a film he made with Luis Buñuel, the now infamous Un chien andalou. Dali's film is quite deliberately unfathomable, the exact opposite of Alistair Sooke's trademark no-nonsense clarity and accessibility.
An astonishingly weird nightmare of irrational and gruesome images, combined with absurd humour, it was a landmark moment in both the history of surrealism and cinema.
I completely agree with Alistair Sooke. Chien andalou was a real landmark watershed moment in the history of cinema because it was showing the moving image as a medium which could really play with your emotions, really play with your subconscious, really produce striking images that were non-narrative, that have this kind of ability to sear themselves into your psyche.
It seems to me that this was one of those moments where two great minds collaborated in the most fertile way.
When BBC 4 decided to teach us how to be a surrealist in 2017, they had the rather brilliant idea of combining two different disciplines via Philippa Perry, psychotherapist and wife of artist Grayson Perry. She wanted to know about the inspiration behind Un chien andalou and got her answer from Buñuel himself.
On a pensé faire ici andalou à cause des rêves que nous avons eus.
Lesquels?
Un rêve de... Lui rêvait qu'il y avait la main pleine de fourmis. Il m'a raconté le rêve. Et moi, j'ai rêvé un couteau qui coupait un œil. Alors, il a dit, on pourrait faire un film avec ça, avec des éléments comme ça, irrationnels. Et nous avons écrit le scénario en 7 jours. Refusait toute image qui pouvait avoir une explication rationnelle.
They tried to make their film a collage of dreamlike images and irrational associations, deliberately without a story, using title cards to jump back and forth in time and disrupt any possibility of it making sense.
30 years earlier, Arena included Dali's own rather grisly account of how they achieved some of the film's startling effects, voiced by Game of Thrones actor Patrick Malahide.
The shooting of the scene of the rotten donkeys and the pianos was a rather fine sight, I must say. I made up the putrefaction of the donkeys with great pots of sticky glue, which I poured over them. I also emptied their eye sockets and made them larger by hacking them out with scissors. In the same way, I furiously cut their mouths open to make the white rows of their teeth show to better advantage, so that it would appear that although the donkeys were already rotting, they were still vomiting up a little more of their own death.
The film premiered in Paris in 1929, and André Breton and his surrealist clique were in the audience, ready to pass judgment. And in 2002, with a major arts remit and the slogan, "Everybody needs a place to think," it seems a certain new digital channel called BBC4 hoped to use Dali's eternal popularity to maximise its launch night viewing figures. So, the first evening's lineup included this less than serious treatment of Dali's dealings with Breton's surrealists, starring a host of British comedians including Stephen Fry as Breton, Matt Lucas as Buñuel, and Trainspotting's Ewan Bremner as Dali.
Breton, I'm pleased you came.
The film held the viewer. May Breton meet the collaborator?
Ah, yeah, well, we call it collaboration, but I do most of the work. The eye, that was me.
I think of Dali's role as something between a scriptwriter, as in he wrote the film with Buñuel, and a production designer, in the sense that, he helped dictate the way the film looked.
Hello, sir.
Dali?
This is the greatest honor in all my life.
Get up, please.
Buñuel, it's a revolutionary work. Oh, I love the ants. I think it's interesting that when BBC4 launched itself with this whole kind of comedic send-up of surrealism, it was surrealism they chose because it was so easy to parody all these exaggerated figures, the motifs, but I think it was Dali that was the kind of catalyst for that.
Dali's unconventional gamble had come up trumps. He was accepted as a fully paid-up member of Surrealism's A-Team, ready to take the world by storm. From here, the only way was up. Dali was without question a highly skilled craftsman. He greatly admired the old masters like Velázquez and Raphael, but he was also influenced by modernist artists like Picasso and Miro. It was under the Surrealist banner that he brought together all those influences and brought in other elements to create his own unique style.
You want to be a surrealist? It's easy.
Over to Robert Hughes to walk us through this early transformation.
He started tamely enough as an art student in Madrid in the early 20s. But around 1925, he discovered what realism could do. It could subvert one's sense of reality. Instead of a modernist surface, Dali went in for what he called all the most paralyzing tricks of eye-fooling: photographic accuracy, masses of detail, and smooth paint. To this he added what he called his paranoid critical method. Basically, this meant looking at one thing and seeing another, as these figures make up a face.
The paranoid critical method, I think, is Dali's most original contribution to modern art. It's using one image and exploring two different meanings within it and seeing something beyond that first image that you might see.
Robert Hughes' masterful voiceover is a classic of early 80s arts TV. But when Philippa Perry went to see another of Dali's famous double images in 2017, she gave us a much more 21st century gut reaction.
You know when you see a paper bag, and at first it isn't a paper bag, it's an incredibly detailed cat, and you're absolutely certain it's a cat. You think, oh, it's a cat, it's about to get run over, and then your mind does a bit more processing, and it's a paper bag. Dali was really interested in this first impression we get, which might be our lasting impression, but it's the one we see through this lens of paranoia.
I think Philippa Perry's film on surrealism is one of the most intelligent films that the BBC's made about surrealism. She really analyses it in a very interesting way, and I think, to have a psychotherapist looking at those works of Dali, his paranoid critical method and the way in which images can kind of morph and become the same thing and different things at the same time, is really key and really works well.
What he's done here is like two images that look very, very similar, but they're actually depicting completely different things. One's a thumb and a finger holding an egg with the Narcissus coming up, and the other is the actual figure of Narcissus himself looking into the pond. But they look the same. It's trying to convey to the viewer that he wanted you to see that one shape could be both things, or many things indeed. It is showing us the unconscious. He's showing you the tricks your mind plays on you.
Initially, Dali's critical paranoiac paintings were a huge hit with Breton's group, and his association with them led to probably the single greatest influence on his life and work. His future wife for 50 years, Gala. The trouble was, she was already married to fellow surrealist Paul Éluard, lampooned here by Vic Reeves. In Omnibus, Ian Gibson gave a distinctly erotic take on how this epic romance began.
One of his surrealist friends was the poet Paul Éluard. Dali invited him and his wife Gala to Cadaqués, and it was love at first sight. All hell broke loose. Gala was a Russian mystery woman with a fabulous body who'd been in bed with everybody. Dali had been in bed with nobody. He was initiated by one of the most experienced people in the business. He was never the same after that moment.
Arena focused less on the physical and more on Gala's profound influence over Dali's career.
Gala was to dominate Dali's life as no other obsession could. He even began to sign his paintings, Gala Dali. Gala was the rock which saved him from madness, and she devoted the rest of her life to promoting his career as an artist.
¿Qué le debe usted a Gala como artista y como genio?
Sobre todo el convencimiento que tengo ahora, gracias a ella, de que no soy tan mediocre como yo creía. Porque ella creyó enseguida que tenía un gran talento. Yo al contrario creí que no.
In summer 1930, Dali bought a fisherman's cottage in Port Ligat near his beloved Cadaqués. He and Gala lived there on and off for more than 40 years. It was there that he created some of his most celebrated masterpieces. Cue Andrew Graham Dixon with one of his foodie arts travelogues, which we all know and love. In The Art of Spain, he even claimed to have discovered Dali's recipe for success.
The Catalonians have always famously been obsessed by food, and Salvador Dali was no exception. This was his favourite restaurant in Cadaqués. And the wonderful thing about it is that if you order a selection of his favourite things to eat, what you end up with are the raw materials for a Salvador Dali painting. Except it's one that you can eat, and that's exactly what I intend to do.
While he was busy enjoying the menu, Alistair Sooke took over the helm, proving that the BBC's art travel blend allows for some fantastic moments of TV discovery. The rocky outcrops around Cadaqués often featured in Dali's paintings, but Sooke obviously wasn't expecting to see some of his favourite animals there too.
Genuinely?
Yeah.
That looks like a rhino leaping up the rocks.
Exactly.
And the camel that's squatted down.
Mm-hmm.
There's one very famous Dali picture that I'm told is based on a specific outcrop. The picture is the extraordinarily named The Great Masturbator, and it was inspired by a rock that, to Dali at least, suggested a great face lying nose down.
I mean, the name The Great Masturbator, immediately, you know, it's a taboo. It's a desire to provoke, to be provocative, to be subversive, to shock. But also, you know, I think Dali did a fair amount of masturbation himself. So probably, you know, this is very much part of, again, him expressing his own fetishes and his own obsessions coming through his work and coming through its titling.
Ah, I'm starting to recognise it. There's his nose. Massive nose, face down.
It looks much better from the other side.
This is the rock. You can see it's exactly the same shape. And it's interesting, there's a bit of rock that goes up there which corresponds to this part of the painting, which is above.
The profile that Sooke so enthusiastically explored appears in what may be Dali's most iconic work. Having digested his lunch, Graham Dixon gave a rather different, pessimistic take on it.
In his most famous early work, The Persistence of Memory, there's the sense of time standing still as it does in dreams, but also a fanatical preoccupation with death.
That tragic puddle of flesh, Dali's own self-portrait, is his way of saying we're all doomed to rot in the grave. Ants, symbolising corruption, crawl over the casing of a pocket watch. Solid objects melt like cheese. Dali actually said his inspiration was a plate of overripe camembert.
Whether Dali's inspiration was cheese-based or not, in 1996, Sister Wendy made it perfectly clear that it was really not to her taste.
Everything we should feel certain of has collapsed and gone berserk. The melting clocks and the distorted face have an inescapable intensity. Dali wants us to be disturbed and to enter with him into his nightmare world. Hollowball painting.
Sister Wendy wasn't the only one to be disturbed by Dali's work. Several programmes were keen to point out, in their own way, how Dali's choice of subject matter meant he was even starting to trouble his own gang.
The paintings that Dali had been working on when he returned to Spain were regarded as a breakthrough by the Surrealists. They felt that he portrayed the elusive world of the subconscious more imaginatively than any of his contemporaries. And André Breton championed him as the new prophet of Surrealist painting. However, it wasn't long before the persistence of some of Dali's obsessions caused Breton to have misgivings.
While Arena skirted delicately around the issue, in 1980, Robert Hughes went for a far more direct approach.
Dali had a brilliant sense of provocation. He even managed to alarm Breton with this one and provoke a solemn argument among his fellow surrealists upon whether a pair of pants spattered with faeces was an acceptable dream image or not.
And by 2002, they just told it like it was.
This man, there's a stain on his shorts.
He shit himself.
Shit?
Yes, he shit in his shirt.
You painted a man with shit in his shorts?
Yes.
You've painted shit?
Do you like my painting?
I prefer the bits without the shit.
The painting with the shit is in 1929. That's at the start of Dali's engagement with Surrealism. So it's clear from the start that Breton and Dali were on a sort of on course for a headlong collision at some point.
The works that Dali created in the decade beginning in 1929 are generally agreed to be his greatest and would propel him from struggling artist to the world's most famous surrealist. But Dali's antics were beginning to appear to the rest of the group less like serious explorations of the unconscious mind and more like cheap publicity stunts. Philippa Perry gave us an example.
When the Surrealists came to London for the International Surrealist Exhibition of 1936, the great British public didn't know quite what to make of them. Dali turned up with a deep-sea diving suit, all the better to descend into the subconscious mind, and the whole thing nearly ended in disaster when he tried to deliver a lecture from inside the suit and nearly suffocated. He was only rescued at the last minute by a poet with a spanner.
It's good to be back in London, no? Dali always feel at home in London.
But it was back in Paris that the friction between Dali and the Surrealists came to a head. Breton summoned him to appear before a sort of bizarre philosophical kangaroo court. Arena's sparse actor's voice and Surrealissimo's comic treatment are worlds apart, and yet they strangely complement each other beautifully.
I was running a fever and getting a sore throat. I dressed very warmly, placed a thermometer under my tongue so as to keep vigilantly thinking about my case.
Don't f*** this up. Give me your hands. You are surrealism.
Breton was looking furious. The fact was that, having forgotten to take the thermometer out of my mouth, what I said was incomprehensible and I was spitting all over him.
Gentlemen, I apologize for my late arrival. I have a cold.
Dali?
Yes, Breton.
does Dali understand the seriousness of this evening? Does Dali understand why he's here?
Yes, I am here because I am a genius.
Psychotherapist Philippa Perry felt it was Breton who should have been on trial for crimes against artistic freedom.
Breton dealt with differences by chucking out whoever he thought transgressed surrealist ideals. He tried to police surrealism in so many ways. He said, you can't design for the ballet, you can't paint shit on trousers, you can't be a homosexual, you can't take pictures of his wife, you can't be a Catholic. He wanted to control their politics, their sexuality, their religion.
Breton accused Salvador Dali of shamelessly commercializing surrealism and made the point with a cruel anagram of his name, meaning greed for money, avida, dollars. More seriously, the mainly left-wing surrealists attacked Dali's apparent support for the rise of fascism in Europe.
Dali admires Hitler.
Yes. Hitler is the Cecil B. DeMille of massacre and death. He is a surrealist.
In a way, I find this the most troubling aspect of Dali's character. The showmanship, all of that, I don't really have a big problem with. But his inability to see Hitler and Franco for what they really were is, I find, very troubling.
Expel this man!
He is a false friend.
But in the end, the big can't was that you can't police surrealism. Hear that, Breton? You can't police surrealism.
Nevertheless, Breton finally did get his way in 1939, when Dali was officially thrown out of the Surrealist Club for good. Was he bothered? Not a bit. He and Gala had already set their sights on much bigger things across the Atlantic.
With the outbreak of World War II, many surrealists fled to the USA, but only Dali truly embraced the New World and made it his own. If Europe had been his rehearsal room, America would be his stage.
This was the beginning of a hugely important chapter in Dali's career, and I find it fascinating to compare how this move has been portrayed over the decades as audiences' tastes have changed. Back in the 80s, Arena didn't feel the need to fill every space with words and music.
In America, Dali went out of his way to court publicity, and he became a celebrity when his face appeared on the cover of Time magazine. Soon after, he was arrested for smashing the window of a Fifth Avenue department store which had dared to alter the display he'd designed. The judge acquitted him of the offence, but as a parting shot, Dali wrote a pamphlet broadcasting the independence of the imagination and the rights of man to his own madness. The resulting publicity secured his notoriety.
Fast forward a decade, and things were a touch more personal.
Dali and Gala spent the 3 years of the Spanish Civil War in Paris, but when the Germans invaded France, they made a beeline for New York. He'd already made several successful visits, and now it seemed not only a haven of safety, but also a potential pot of gold.
And by 2010, arts programs had noticeably stepped up a gear. To attract a broader audience, they had to have more energy and be more fun. Alistair Sooke was happy to oblige.
We all know that today's artists manipulate the way they're presented in the media. Everyone from Madonna and Tracy Emin to Lady Gaga play up to the cameras and understand the power of publicity. But in many ways, it was Dali who blazed a trail for them. When he arrived here in New York, the circus had come to town.
New York became a showcase for Dali's work. He exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art, designed shop windows on Fifth Avenue, and even made a surreal installation at the World's Fair. He called his creation the Dream of Venus, a pleasure dome filled with naked women and unfettered desire.
Here you see 3 different films with three entirely different modes all coming to the same conclusion, that this was an extraordinary opportunity for Dali, but done in very different ways. There's an almost mournful quality, perhaps appropriately, to the Arena film. Then you get that much more sort of introspective quality that Ian Gibson's film has. He's a biographer searching for his subject, desperately trying to get to the bottom of this intriguing character. And then you get Alistair Sooke's film, which is much more extravagant and exciting and, you know, the feeling of entering a new world. So 3 different decades, but 3 very similar conclusions.
However they did it, all these programmes are indeed saying the same thing. In the 40s, Dali hit the Big Apple and took a huge bite.
Además, cuando yo llegué a Nueva York y me pidieron una definición de qué es el surrealismo, Dalí dijo, el surrealismo soy yo. Y era verdad.
The Americans fell in love with his paintings, and of course he just loved their dollars.
Dali was taken up by the wealthy and decided that the quickest way to make big money was to paint society portraits. What could be more novel to wealthy Americans than to see themselves meticulously portrayed in slick, surrealist settings?
The portraits depict the elite of American society in an ironic style which parodies the great portraits of the Italian Renaissance.
By the point he went to America, his art really was somewhat of a retread. He became almost like a performance artist, really. I mean, the portraits were awful that he did.
Some of the most disgusting work I've ever seen. You know, and these society portraits, yes, they refer to the Renaissance, but actually, my God.
With a host of rich patrons, Dali was fast becoming one of the world's most commercially successful artists. But even that wasn't enough. He wanted his work to be seen on the largest canvas of all, Hollywood's silver screen.
In 1945, Alfred Hitchcock asked Dali to design the dream sequences around which the plot of his new psychological thriller revolved.
It seemed to be a gambling house. But there weren't any walls, just a lot of curtains with eyes painted on them.
Headhunted by Hollywood's foremost director, he'd come a long way since his previous eye-slitting moment in Un Chien Andalou.
I requested Dali. Selznick, the producer, had the impression that I wanted Dali for the publicity value. Yeah. That wasn't it at all. What I was after was, again, the thing we talked about earlier, the vividness of dreams. As you know, all Dali's work is very solid and very sharp, with very long perspectives and black shadows. Actually, I wanted the dream sequences to be shot on the back lot, not in the studio at all. I wanted them shot in the bright sunshine, so the cameraman would be forced to what we call stop down and get a very hard image. This was, again, the avoidance of the cliché. All dreams in movies are blurred. It isn't true. Dali was the best man for me to do the dreams because that's what dreams should be.
Dali's unique dream-like imagery also seemed perfect for collaboration with another Hollywood giant, Walt Disney. The animated short called Destino was abandoned during pre-production in 1946. More than 60 years later, Alistair Sooke took us behind the scenes again to meet the man who finally brought Dali's vision to life.
Dali had always admired Walt Disney's animation. He thought that that was a natural extension of surrealism. I've got a couple examples of some of the visual development work that he did, and this is actually one of my favorite pieces. I really like this piece a lot. There's a baby carriage for this woman's head, and she's wearing the snail slippers, which are kind of interesting.
What does it mean?
You know, it beats me. I don't know what it means, but I like looking at it.
I love this sequence because the animator is clearly really inspired by these crazy images that he's seeing, but as he says, he doesn't understand what they mean. but actually they have very specific meanings. You know, the snail was deeply connected to these soft forms which relate to flaccid penises in his paintings. So what you have, and I think this is brilliant, in a way, is Dali from beyond the grave subverting the whole Disney universe.
Anything like melting clocks or a telephone receiver like a spider, those things are just perfect for animation. Absolutely perfect. They're whimsical, they're fantasy, they're fun. Those are the types of things you want to see in animation.
Dali's sense of fun was a welcome breath of fresh air in the over-serious world of art of the time. All his witty visual puns explain why his art works so well on television, and he applied that sense of fun to more than just his paintings.
In the 1930s, Dali pioneered the idea of the surrealist object. When Alistair Sooke tackled the subject with his signature insatiable curiosity, he left no stone unturned to understand why one in particular became instantly recognizable: the lobster telephone.
This is one of the most famous things of the 20th century.
It's your ultimate surrealist composite object. What it does is it takes two completely disparate, pre-existing things, a lobster and a telephone, puts them together and creates a fantastic new reality.
But why do you think that this one has become so incredibly famous?
It's a very simple idea, brilliantly done. It actually was made as a working telephone. Of course, there's this fantastic slippage between the shape of the receiver and the lobster, but also the idea of talking to a lobster is, of course, you know, a very witty and humorous thing.
Another of his iconic visual gags was this lip-shaped sofa based on the mouth of Hollywood legend Mae West. He'd cracked this joke before in a painting called Mae West's Face, which may be used as a surrealist apartment. He wasn't kidding either, as Andrew Graham Dixon discovered in 2008.
This is the Mae West apartment. Oh, look. All the images resolve into the face of Mae West. Fantastically clever.
In their 8 years in America, Dali and Gala passionately promoted surrealism at star-studded parties and lavish events. But as a serious art movement, surrealism's days were numbered. For me, it was Alan Yentob, still at his trusty lectern, who best identified the problems facing surrealism.
Although it walked on the dark side of dreams and desires, it couldn't help being sexy and seductive, and therefore enormously popular. Lobster telephones, fur-lined teacups, wheelbarrow chairs, for all their kinky transgressiveness, are never less than desirable. And it was through these obscure objects of desire that surrealism slipped from avant-garde into mainstream consumer culture. From Freud's couch to Mae West's lips, the journey was a short one. And in the process, radical became radical chic, and then simply chic.
From Breton's lofty intellectual ambitions, the pendulum had swung the other way. Thanks to Dali, surrealism had suffered the worst fate imaginable, a mainstream stamp of approval. For Robert Hughes, the joke had obviously begun to wear thin even earlier.
Like a gland irritated by constant scratching, his mind threw off many such images before the end of the 30s, when they began to get rather tedious and predictable. And most of them had to do with sex, blood, dung and putrefaction mixed with declarations of impotence and guilt. Eventually, the dreams weren't real at all. Just Dali being Dali, the Nickelodeon of the id.
Nickelodeon of the id, that's fantastic. I love Robert Hughes, what a good turn of phrase. I mean, yes, I think he did become this sort of fairground attraction, and he did become this self-parody. And it wasn't really about the subconscious, it wasn't really about being genuinely subversive, it was about being provocative and showing off.
None of this troubled Dali, of course. His circus clown persona, carefully constructed to mask his shyness, had become the star attraction, with his art playing something of a supporting role. From here on in, the publicity stunts would grow more outrageous, the parties wilder, and the moustaches even longer. So were his days as a serious artist behind him? Or was he still capable of the innovation and invention that marked his earlier work?
In the 1950s and 60s, the world turned from black and white to colour. And it soon became clear to television producers, as much as to anyone else, that Dali was just beginning to come out of his shell.
Bonjour! Good morning.
After America, Dali and Gala returned to Port Ligat and their beloved fisherman's cottage, which became his main studio. With his usual personal take, Alistair Sooke got close to his subject by bringing us inside Dali's home.
Look at these enormous windows just letting in all of this beautiful Port Ligat light. You can imagine a couple of melting watches floating there, and you've got your Dali masterpiece. He always sat down in this white armchair and had the canvas arranged on this structure in front of him. And this is really, really ingenious. It actually allows Dali to move the canvas up and down through the floor so he could paint on this vast scale. And you can see all of his paints and brushes, the details so precise and was so important to him that he had to use these tools, these very, very fine sable hair brushes to kind of get the effects that he needed.
In 1950, Dali put sable brush to huge canvas and once again began to paint what he saw out the window, the Cadaqués coastline. Only this time it became part of one of his most striking images ever, his vision of the crucifixion.
Christ of St. John on the Cross is both Dali's best late work and an object of supreme kitsch.
The crucifixion is a very, very striking image, but it's somehow a little bit inert and overly theatrical.
I think it can be both those things at the same time, and I think that's consistent with a lot of the late work of Dali, this supreme technical skill, and yet the imagery is often very troubling, difficult, and distasteful.
Christ of St. John on the Cross marked a newfound interest in Catholicism for the former atheist, although his exact views on religion remained less than clear.
Creo en Dios, pero no tengo la fe. Por las matemáticas y por las ciencias particulares, sé que es indiscutible que Dios tiene que existir, pero no me lo creo.
In 1970's Canvas, Archbishop Anthony Bloom told us that the work had been bought by Glasgow museums, although the minuscule TV budget apparently wouldn't stretch to a train ticket.
As you can see, we are not at present in the Glasgow Art Gallery. This is my cathedral church in London, and the talk which I'm going to give on Dali's crucifixion is set against the background of a quite different...
Recently, slow TV has become quite a hit on the BBC, so maybe this film was just ahead of its time. 12 minutes in, and the Archbishop finally arrives at this rather perplexing conclusion.
His painting must be ultra-individualistic. It must be a paroxysm of joy. It must be his own experience projected on canvas.
Taking the projection idea quite literally, 32 years later, BBC Scotland livened things up a bit by switching out the Archbishop for some young Glasgow artists.
I suppose it's quite a cinematic looking painting. It's quite a striking image, just got that kind of impact straight away.
I think it's quite appropriate that you've got it projected against the kind of wall here. I mean, the experience, I suppose, is like seeing an apparition.
It was a stunning piece of work, and it looked as if it should have been on an album cover.
I mean, you could just imagine it as an album cover in 1975. Up above the Dali image, it would be like the Grateful Dead live at the Glasgow Apollo in 1975 or something like that, you know.
Holy concept album covers aside, Dali was developing another obsession that would also become a major theme in his artwork, with explosive results.
After the explosion of the first atom bomb in 1945, Dali's painting and self-promotion began to draw heavily and very idiosyncratically on first nuclear physics and soon after DNA and the origins of life.
Dali explained this fascination to Malcolm Muggeridge, back when the word gay still meant simply happy or excited.
Because myself believe, contrary, que the modern atomic age is very gay. No, nothing is more gay than the collision and explosion of intra-atomic conflicts of nuclear physics.
You feel that really livens things up enormously.
For me, is the more happy thing is look these terrific conflicts about electrons and pi mesons and atoms. Is everything jumping and romping in a completely extraordinary eurythmic feeling.
There is a sincerity in the way that Dali wants to try and grapple with this stuff, but they're horribly kitsch in so many ways. I mean, many of them are awful, I think.
And so really that represented a phase in your career, those jokes that we all knew about, and now you move on and all your life will be to the rhythm of atomic explosion.
Exactly, one new kind of atomic and nuclear mysticism.
Well, thank you very much. That's a fascinating phrase, nuclear mysticism.
In these interviews, Dali seems uncharacteristically honest and sincere about exploring all these new ideas. Could it be that he was entering a new, a more mature phase of his life? Was he getting ready to leave behind all those silly antics and, frankly, wacky stunts?
Maybe not. In the 1970s, Dali spent much of his time in Paris and New York, becoming quite the social butterfly.
Butterfly.
Continuing his biographical approach, Ian Gibson braved rush hour traffic to take us to Dali's favourite New York hangout.
Well, it's a nice, quiet location. It's a nice, quiet location in the middle of Fifth Avenue. Dali was crazy about New York and decided to become the king, and I think he certainly achieved that. Whenever he came here, he stayed in the St. Regis, and he always stayed in the same suite. Unfortunately, they're not letting us into film. The King Cole Bar is in another bit of the building, and that's where Dali's court used to gather.
Alistair Sooke had more luck when he spoke to artist Louis McCoyer, although it's a little hard to hear over the sound of dropping names.
Anybody who's rich and famous stopped by, the Rolling Stones, the Grateful Dead, you know, you name the people, David Bowie, Andy Warhol was always here. Warhol had at one time made a gift to Dali of a Marilyn lithograph that he had done. So he brought it to Dali.
You gave him one of the Marilyns?
He gave him one of the Marilyns. Dali didn't think Warhol was a very good painter at all. And Dali promptly put it on the floor, unzipped his fly, and pissed on it.
Well, in front of him?
In front of Warhol, which Warhol didn't mind at all. He thought it was great.
So I love the idea of these two attention-seeking artists kind of almost outvying themselves to be outrageous and not to be shocked by each other.
Stunts like these only reinforced the Dali brand. In Arena, his former business manager revealed the extent to which he lent his name to a bewildering array of tacky merchandise.
Sculptures, ties, shirts, shoes, aeroplane decoration, jigsaw puzzles. I got a commission on every deal that was made for anything but paintings.
And for those who accused Dali of being too commercial, his response was, well, two commercials. First, for a French brand of chocolate.
Je suis fou du chocolat Lanvin.
First, it dissolves.
Followed, somewhat logically, by one for Alka-Seltzer.
Then the Alka-Seltzer shoots into the stomach. Here, it neutralizes that bad excess acid. Meantime, the special evapor aspirin is speeding into your bloodstream to all places of pain. So those beautiful places will feel beautiful again. Alka-Seltzer is a work of art, truly one of a kind, like Dali.
Part of it was him being the defiant, naughty boy. I'm making loads of money, look at me, I'm having a ball, and I don't care.
But amid all the clowning around, Dali was working on one last major project. In the Spanish town of Figueres, where he was born, he was building a museum, a monument to surrealism. This would become Dali's home after Gala's death in 1982, and ultimately his own final resting place. By 2008, in contrast to the Muggeridge era, critics like Andrew Graham Dixon had become far more critical.
Dali himself is buried under the floor, and this really is just a gigantic kitsch mausoleum to the degraded memory of what surrealism had once been, with its huge theatrical pastiches, its Liberace, fag-end, papier-mâché surrealist objects, its absurd waxen Christ. It's almost as if he's sort of emasculated himself, held up his own testicles and said, look, this is how bad I can really be.
Dali claimed that his museum was the world's largest surrealist object. But the trouble is that it isn't actually very surreal at all, in the sense of being genuinely disturbing. It's more like a giant amusement arcade. There's a car where it rains on the inside, but only if you throw in a coin. The truth is that although Dali was briefly one of the greatest painters of the 20th century, he'd lost the plot as early as the 1940s.
But then, Dali also left us another, less obvious legacy.
His work continues to influence contemporary artists and the advertising industry.
Just as the word surreal has entered everyday language, the surrealists, and especially Dali's visual puns and sense of playfulness, have become ubiquitous in the world of advertising. Philippa Perry points out the irony of it all.
Magritte had been an ad man in his time, and he understood the pleasure there is in connecting the dots, in getting the joke. What would Breton say today if he saw his ideas being used not to unsettle us from our bourgeois reality, but to sell credit cards?
And what about all those fag ads from the 70s and 80s? Surrealism can seriously damage your health.
It really was quite extraordinary what he did, and the fact that it was so imitated and so influential, albeit to flog products rather than to kind of subvert society, is that not, quite a lasting legacy in and of itself?
So who was the real Salvador Dali? The vulgar showman crudely promoting himself through shot tactics and stunts? Or the truly great artist who, through skill and imagination, brought surrealism to the masses and changed the way that we see the world? Perhaps it was a bit of both. And in my view, there's no problem with that.
The only difference between one crazy man and Dali is very simple. Dali is not crazy at all.